this is going to be our third time trying to record this episode, so hopefully this works. So on Tuesday, Biden announced yet more funding. This time it's going to be 128 million. That's going to 186 environmental justice projects that are intended to combat climate change in underserved communities. So the Washington Times reported on Wednesday there's an anonymous senior administrative official in the Biden administration who apparently would not do the interview with reporters without being anonymous, which I find weird. But anyway, this anonymous official said in a press call, quote, "We know that too many communities, particularly low-income communities and communities of color, have suffered unjustly from high levels of environmental pollution while lacking the resources needed to access federal funding. That's why from day one, President Biden has made achieving environmental justice a top priority as a part of the president's Investing in America agenda. We're continuing to advance environmental justice with a sense of urgency because the people of this country are relying on us," end quote. And it was very hard for me to read that with a straight face because President Biden does nothing to invest in America. But anyway, where is this funding going? So here's a few examples. In Jackson, Mississippi, they're going to tear down abandoned buildings to create micro parks so that they can reduce flood risk and increase, quote, equitable access to green infrastructure. In Columbus, Ohio, former prison inmates are going to be hired for solar industry jobs. In North Dakota, the Department of Environmental Quality is going to distribute 600 radon tests to 50 low-income households in 3 low-income areas to, quote, fill gaps in radon awareness testing and mitigation, because that's what low-income families are concerned about. In Rochester, New York, the city is going to create fully electric homes with rooftop solar and electric vehicle charging station for residents who are, quote, disproportionately impacted by climate change and least financially able to adapt. So again, like, is this really what low-income communities need? Solar panels and charging stations for electric vehicles that they can't afford in the first place?
Yeah, no kidding. Like, I feel like these low income areas are dealing with record crime. First of all, that needs to be addressed. Sky high food prices. And then we have fentanyl everywhere. Like, I could think of so many other things that money should be spent on. And here's the thing, if we had a ton of extra money lying around, I would be totally fine with that. Like, go ahead and build your parks or whatever. But we are $33 trillion in debt. Biden should not be allowed to fund any more extra projects or programs until that problem gets addressed. And programs that are not an absolute necessity, like solar panels, should completely be off the table. I mean, this is just idiotic. And I was thinking about the debt the other day, and like, this is just going on a tangent for a minute, but just bear with me. Like, I was thinking about this $33 trillion in debt and how every single American citizen and every single business here is taxed. Then we take that hard-earned money and it's taxed again when it hits our bank account or paycheck or whatever. Then we take that to go buy something and we pay a sales tax. And then we use that money to buy a home and then we pay property taxes. And if we sell the home and we don't reinvest it in another property, then we pay a capital gains tax. And then when we die, our kids get taxed on whatever we have. Like, it's just so crazy. And I'm sure there's like so many other ways in which we get taxed throughout our life. But the point is that the people who are in charge of taking this money and managing it somehow got us into $33 trillion worth of debt. And now they want to spend more money to make green parks and solar panels in underprivileged neighborhoods. Like, this is just crazy. If we had an accountant or an employee that did that with like our money or our business, we would fire them immediately. We wouldn't give them a penny more. But here we're all still paying taxes to the government that's completely mismanaging the funds. It's crazy.
Yeah, and we'd also probably sue the fuck out of them for mishandling the funds, and they probably get thrown in jail for the way they misappropriate things. But as speaking of electric vehicles, I want to talk about some of the fun stuff that's happening in Europe. So A report came out in the Telegraph last week about how electric cars in Europe are becoming uninsurable because of the price of battery repairs and replacements. So, according to Jonathan Hewitt, he is chief executive of Thatcham Research. There's currently no way of understanding whether a battery has been compromised or damaged when an electric vehicle gets in a minor accident like a fender bender. And he said, quote, "The battery is an extremely expensive component of an electric vehicle. And until we find efficient ways of dealing with it, we have the challenge of high premiums for electric vehicles, which nobody wants. The threat of thermal runaway means that catastrophic fires can take place if the cells of the batteries have been damaged in a collision. What we're struggling to understand at the moment is how we approach that diagnostic technique. It's like a doctor trying to understand what's wrong with you without any notes or an x-ray," end quote. And then the article goes on to talk about how several insurance companies in the UK have basically just stopped providing insurance for electric cars. And then for those that do still provide insurance, the cost is sky high. They gave this example of since the beginning of the year, insurance costs overall have risen due to inflation. But for gas and diesel cars, and insurance has risen 29%, but for electric vehicles, it's risen 72%. And on average, people are paying a minimum of €100 a week for coverage, which is the equivalent of $105 a week in the United States. So that's over $5,000 a year to insure an electric vehicle, when on average, a gas or diesel vehicle is $2,000 or less. And then if you do get in an accident, government guidelines in the UK suggest that electric vehicles with damaged batteries need to be, quote, quarantined away from other cars because of the risk of battery fires. So when an electric vehicle goes in for repair, they have to keep them 50 feet away from other cars in case they explode. And so this research company is reporting that insurers would need to spend over 9 million euros, which again, 900 million euros, which again is over $900 million a year, on quarantine facilities for damaged electric vehicles as a result of required safety measures that are going into effect in the UK by 2035. And according to this article, the London Fire Brigade has already warned that fires involving lithium batteries are the fastest growing fire risk in London. They responded to 87 electric bike fires and 29 electric scooter fires last year. And in Paris, France, the transport operator withdrew 149 electric buses from operation after 2 of them caught fire in separate incidents.
Yeah, that's my biggest concern with them. I think it was a few years ago, I saw a video of, I think it was a Tesla, and all it did was hit a stop sign, and the thing completely went up in flames, and the people were stuck inside. And then there were all these articles that were saying how these fires are really common, and they're trying to figure it out, but it's just the battery can get so hot. And I was thinking and then you're putting it in your garage and charging it, which is attached to your house. There's no way, until I was absolutely sure they fixed that, there's no way I'd be getting an electric vehicle.
Exactly. And I guarantee that the more these fires come up with these batteries and more explosions, the more home insurance is also going to go up for people who have them and keep them in garages. It's going to be renters with pit bulls, or certain breeds of aggressive dogs, where housing companies won't rent to them unless they pay more. And then some places won't allow them at all because of liability. And maybe that sounds like a stupid comparison, but I believe that's where we're headed with the fucking electric cars.
It's already happening. There's insurance companies that houses did set on fire, and they're not paying it. They're not paying the insurance money because the charging station that was set up was not properly set up, because a lot of people will just get the dryer outlet because it's cheaper. And then I guess the insurance company doesn't cover it. So then you're screwed.
Yeah, it's crazy. And then aside from the insurance issues, here in the United States, there's more and more research coming out about the real cost of electric vehicles. And what this is going to mean for residents of states with the total like climate crisis tyranny governors who want to turn their blue states green and get rid of gas powered cars. So let's look at Colorado, for example, because the Washington Examiner just published an article a couple days ago. There was a new research report called Colorado's Energy Future, the High Cost of 100% Electric Vehicles. And according to this report, if the governor of Colorado, Jared Polis, he has this plan to like convert to 100% renewable electricity, have like all electric residential space heating and light duty transportation and electric vehicles. And if Colorado does this, the report is saying that Colorado residents will pay $695.3 billion through 2050, which would result in the typical Colorado resident paying an average monthly electricity bill, Stephanie, of $907. $907,
wow.
up from like 180 was like the typical bill in 2021, and I'm guessing by now it's probably 200 or 300, but not almost $1,000. And the report states that the high costs for energy are related to the need for like this massive and rapid overbuilding of new wind and solar facilities that are needed to bolster the grid and ensure enough energy is supported to like generate heating people's homes and sufficiently charging their electric cars.
Yeah, and we talked about it on a previous episode where instead of building all these solar farms, if they just built trees on that land instead, it would be better for the environment and it would clean the air. And I wonder if that's why my electric bill is so high. Like everyone in my neighborhood is talking about how it's like quadrupled since we moved in. And it's probably because of stuff like that they're doing. But, aside from just the cost, it's not practical to have these electric vehicles. Like if I'm driving long distance, which I do a lot, we go on a lot of little like family, weekends away and stuff. I want to be able to quickly stop and fill up my tank. I don't want to have to drive around like off the interstate, finding a charging station only to have to sit there and wait a minimum of 30 minutes while the thing charges up, maybe more. Like they need to work on that, work on the technology, work on the grid before they implement any goals. They have this whole thing backwards, and it's just crazy that people are spending that much money on their electric bill to pay for it.
Yeah, and that's like what you just said with the driving long distance. That's if there's even a charging station available. Like, remember we did that podcast a couple months ago about fucking Jennifer Granholm's entourage making this family with the baby wait to charge their electric vehicle, and it was like the middle of summer during a heat wave because they were holding the charging station for her. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if they implement VIP charging stations so like wealthy people won't have to wait with the peasant class to fuel their cars. But I want to talk a little bit more about the financial side of electric vehicles, because here was another report I found interesting. So on Wednesday, Fox News reported that the Texas Public Policy Foundation published an analysis by energy experts this week, concluding that electric vehicles are basically indeed a financial sham, and that the only reason that they're remotely affordable right now is because of extreme government subsidies. So the report states that like they took the average model year 2021 electric vehicle, and they said it would cost approximately $49,000 more to own over a 10-year period without the $22 billion in taxpayer funded handouts that the government provides to electric vehicle manufacturers and owners. And so like we all know the Biden administration has been pushing their goal of ensuring that at least 50% of all vehicles purchased by 2030 will be electric. And what this report found was that electric vehicles have received 7 times more credits under federal fuel efficiency programs than they provide in actual fuel economy benefits, and that the total regulatory credits from federal and state fuel efficiency and greenhouse gas emission standards amounts to an average of almost $28,000 per vehicle for these electric vehicle makers. And on top of that, the cost of charging stations strain on the US electrical grid amounts to an average of almost $12,000 per electric vehicle over 10 years. And who pays for these costs? We do, the taxpayers. the taxpayers who don't even own fucking electric vehicles. And one of the authors of this report, his name is Jason Isaacs, he told Fox Digital, quote, the Biden administration and leftist states such as California have pushed for widespread electrification in less than 20 years through government subsidies and coercive regulations. But the price you see in the lot is not the true cost of an electric vehicle. Electric vehicle owners have been the beneficiaries of regulatory credits, subsidies, and socialized infrastructure costs totaling nearly $50,000 per vehicle. These costs are borne by gasoline vehicle owners, taxpayers, and utility ratepayers, who are all paying a hefty price for someone else's electric vehicle, end quote. And then the report concluded, quote, the stark reality for proponents of EVs and for the dreamers in federal government who are using fuel economy regulations to force manufacturers to produce more EVs is the true cost of an EV is in no way close to a comparable ICEV, which is an internal combustion engine vehicle or gas-powered vehicle. Without increased and sustained government favors, EVs will remain more expensive than ICEVs for many years to come. Even with these subsidies, EVs have been challenging for dealers to sell, and why basic economic realities indicate that the Biden administration's dream of achieving 100% EVs by 2040 will never become a reality.
Yeah, and I can see it already, like pulling up to a charging station, they get all these EVs on the road. They're going to eventually charge for that. It'll be just like gassing up your car. They'll like charge, or they'll put a limit on how long you can charge your vehicle. They'll figure out a way to control it and make money off of it. And then the other cost too is the battery. Like you said, like you could get in a fender bender and the whole battery could be bad. So you got to pay for that to get replaced, which is not the same as paying for a battery in a gas vehicle. You're paying for this huge thing, and then you have to pay to dispose of it and get all these fees for that. So it's just not practical.
And hope it doesn't explode in the meantime.
Yeah, hope it doesn't burn your house down and then the insurance company won't pay you for that. It's insane. But aside from the cost, I was reading an article in the Epic Times about how Chinese green companies are now a security risk to the US. And the article reads, quote, companies backed by the Chinese Communist Party may exploit its green energy technology to achieve strategic, political, and intelligence advantages over the United States, end quote. So I guess there was a report that was released, and the report said, quote, the growth of these industries furthers the White House's climate and renewable energy goals, but may pose significant risks to U.S. critical infrastructure, data security, and supply chain integrity. So this was from Craig Singleton, who was the author of the report that came out and a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And they used the example of Ford, the American company that was incentivized by the Inflation Reduction Act to make cars in the US, yet their supply chain is reliant on China. So like more wasteful spending by the Biden administration because China is going to end up with those funds. And Ford announced what's now a paused partnership with Chinese electric vehicle battery maker CATL. And I guess they signed an agreement to license CATL's battery technology, but lawmakers and local community members started sharing concerns about how this company is a champion of the CCP. And as we know, Chinese citizens and companies are expected to gather intelligence for the CCP. Like they have to. I mean, just look at Jack Ma, who was the founder of Alibaba, and that was one of the largest Chinese companies. The guy went missing for months after criticizing the CCP. So it's like you have to play along with them. And so this article is warning that CATL's derivative products of EV charging and battery storage solutions could, quote, serve as potential access points for intelligence collection of cyber espionage and sabotage, with widespread blackouts impacting industrial centers or financial hubs. Like that would be the worst case scenario. That's a pretty big worst case scenario. And it's just such a shame when you see an American company like Ford that is so closely tied to the CCP.
And yet not surprising, because speaking of China, let's talk about California dictator Gavin Newsom, who is currently spending the week in China on what I can only describe as like a climate crisis promotional tour. So he was in Shenzhen on Tuesday, and Fox Business reported that while he was there, he test drove a $160,000 hybrid vehicle manufactured by a company called BYD, which is a Chinese automakers with, surprise, surprise, direct ties to the CCP. And they've received like billions of dollars in grants and subsidies from the Chinese government. So Republican members of Congress, and especially ones from Newsom's home state of California, are having a field day with this clip that was posted of Newsom test driving the car. Rep. Doug LaMalfa stated, quote, "To promote China's polluting industry while destroying California jobs and making everything more expensive is a textbook example of Democrat priorities," end quote. Another California rep, Michelle Steele, said, quote, "It's a slap in the face to Californians to see Governor Newsom promote the CCP's electric cars built off the backs of slave labor. Meanwhile, he and the Democratic Party discourage the mining of critical materials required to make the batteries for these cars," end quote. And Rep. Jay Obernolte, also from California, stated, quote, "I find it ironic that Governor Newsom is using his time in China to promote the Chinese-produced BYD hybrid when his own administration is attempting to restrict sales of hybrid vehicles like the one he drove," end quote. And then I read this really great op-ed in The Hill by Derek Hunter, and it came out on Wednesday, and he was talking about, Newsom's trip to China and calling it what we all know it is, basically a shadow campaign for his presidential nomination. And he described it as, quote, "just in case President Biden succumbs to the realities of his age and waning mental capacity," end quote. And so in this op-ed, Hunter wrote, quote, "In China, Newsom is signing meaningless, symbolic agreements on climate change with counterparts who probably don't intend to honor them. His trip is a minor propaganda win for the world's biggest and most unrepentant carbon polluter. China's ruling Communist Party, after all, is already building more than 100 new coal-fired power plants, and each week it reportedly approves permits for 2 additional new ones. So Newsom's trip to China is a perfect symbol of his and his state's ardent commitment to pretend to do something about what he calls, quote, the climate crisis," end quote. And so, side note, Stephanie, like, don't you find it pretty pathetic that a governor is getting better reception from Xi Jinping than the president of the United States? And like, even before this, Newsom went to Israel last week to talk with war victims. I mean, he's doing things that the president's supposed to be doing. And every article I've read about him being in China is talking about how he's there to help improve diplomatic relations with China and the US, and talk about the climate crisis and the fentanyl crisis. And like, aren't these conversations that world leaders should be having with their equal and not a state governor? And like, again, we all know Newsom's being groomed for the presidency that he continues to deny he's going to run for. And it's like, come on already. We know what the fuck is happening here. And like, I don't mean to go off on a tangent, but this whole fucking game being played by the left is getting old. Newsom doesn't give a fuck about climate change or the fentanyl crisis. And this trip to China has nothing to do with any of that.
Yeah, I think it's crystal clear, and of course he's not going to admit it because they're waiting. They're waiting until Biden is either no longer here or hospitalized because he's clearly like on the verge. And then he'll say, "Oh, I'll jump in there." I mean, it's so clear, like they're playing their cards and showing their hand. But like, I think that this proves too that the left is now the party of the elite, like the extremely wealthy part of our society. And they're just totally out of touch with what real Americans, left or right, are facing day to day. But here's one that you're going to like. So, our favorite climate alarmist, Greta Thunberg. Well, she posted on X, quote, "The world needs to speak up and call for an immediate ceasefire, justice, and freedom for Palestinians and all civilians affected," end quote. And the post included a picture of her with 3 other activists that had signs that read "Free Palestine," "Climate Justice Now," and another one that said "This Jew stands with Palestine," and then "Stand with Gaza." And it ended up getting deleted because in the photo included a blue octopus that had a frowning face and was sitting on one of the activist's legs. And apparently, like they said that they didn't realize that that is viewed as an anti-Semitic symbol. So anyhow, Israel's X account, which is managed by the Middle Eastern country's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, fired back saying, quote, Hamas doesn't use sustainable materials for their rockets, which have butchered innocent Israelis. The victims of the Hamas massacre could have been your friends. Speak up. And you know what? They make a great point because Little Miss Climate Change doesn't like pollution. Yet just last month, she was in Ukraine to support the war. And now she's in support of Hamas, who's using rockets that sure as hell aren't good for the planet. And it's just funny how, in the minds of these climate activists, it's okay to destroy the planet in war, but it's not okay to drive a gas vehicle. And I think it just points out how, like, none of this is really about the environment. It's more just them being like young kids who hate the world and need an outlet to express their rage. And those festival goers that were massacred by Hamas probably would have been the type of people that would follow Greta, is like they were all, you know, these young, like hippie type kids. And, you know, for her to just completely dismiss that is terrible. And I'm glad she deleted the post because it shouldn't be up there. But anyhow, like after that, there is this viral video going around and it's not real. It's like a deep fake. It's meant for satire, but I have to play it because I was laughing so freaking hard when I heard this. And it's basically like a deep fake of Greta Thunberg talking about sustainable weapons of war, which is actually probably something stupid she'd say, but it is just like for satire purposes. So listen to this.
It's always bad, specifically for the planet. If we want to continue fighting battles like environmentally conscious humans, we must make the change to sustainable tanks and weaponry. There are so many new concepts for battery-powered fighter jets that can carry many more missiles, biodegradable missiles, of course. Something literally everybody can do to stop this nonsense is, for example, block the roads to gardens and farms so the plants don't get overrun by these heavy, heavy tanks. Hand grenades, very important. If you use hand grenades, please use vegan grenades. No animal should have to give their life for all this mayhem and chaos. They have a special sticker on them. You really can't miss them in the grenade market or wherever you buy them. Yeah, I cover all of this and more in my newest book, Vegan Wars.
Vegan grenades. When I first saw that video, I like thought it was real because she's so stupid. She probably would say stuff like that, but I just had to play that for everyone because it's like you have to poke fun at this stuff, otherwise it'll just drive us mad. But yeah, like the girl who's all about climate change really is, you know, over there talking with Zelensky in Ukraine and all for these rockets and missile launches.
Yeah, okay. Since you brought that up, and like the whole Israel-Hamas war, I saw this in the Washington Times on Wednesday. So I know we've talked about this chick before, Abby Vetch. She's one of like the millionaire leftist wackos from the Sierra Club. Well, she and former Wall Street Journal meteorologist Eric Holthouse apparently did an interview in this online publication called Currently. And they claimed that the deadly conflict between Hamas and Israel is connected to climate justice, because it has to do with the purported 2 degrees Celsius rise in global temperature. Like,
wow.
what the fuck? Like, seriously, these people are so out of left field with the climate shit. Like, I guarantee you, if this Eric dude got a bad blowjob, he'd blame it on fucking climate change.
He probably would. You're right.
And okay, so now let's talk about the power grid. You know, the one we already mentioned we don't have the infrastructure for, because for any of you that still have doubts about the ability for America to exist on electricity without oil and gas, Just the News recently reported there's a brand new report from the International Energy Agency that concludes that the size of the global electricity grid is going to need to double by 2040 in order to reach the global emissions reductions target that is in line with the Paris Agreement. So what that means is that the world is going to need to either refurbish or add 50 million miles of new transmission lines within the next 17 years. And that's the equivalent of circling the equator more than 2,000 times. And so the IEA, International Energy Agency, is also estimating that global investments in transmission capacity will need to double to 600 billion per year by 2030 in order to reach this goal. So how does this impact us here in the US? Well, we already talked about the Colorado example, but let's talk about the country as a whole. So last week, Biden announced more money, $3.5 billion that would be going to 58 different infrastructure projects across our country. And of course, our idiotic Department of Energy Secretary, Jennifer Granholm, stated that this will be, quote, the largest ever direct investment in critical grid infrastructure, supporting projects that will harden systems, improve energy reliability and affordability, almost couldn't say that word, all while generating union jobs for highly skilled workers, end quote. But what's the real cost of this? So here in the United States, we currently have 240,000 miles of high voltage transmission lines. That's not accounting for like local lines. If that amount were to be tripled, it would equal 720,000 miles of high voltage lines that would need to be built. So according to Xcel Energy, which is actually my power company in Texas, an overhead high voltage power line costs approximately $2 to $2.5 million. So based on this lower estimate of 720,000 miles of power lines, that would require an investment by our government of $1.44 trillion.
Again, money we don't have. But I mean, what's another trillion for the debt? You know, it's like just a little over $1 trillion. Like, it's so aggravating. And then what? Like, these power lines are just going to end up getting blown up because he's putting us into World War III. So it's like, get your priorities straight. And with inflation being so bad, like we already talked about this, like no one is in a position to buy an electric vehicle or an electric stove or any of the other nonsense that this administration is pushing.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. And then there's all of the other costs, right? There's a very complicated permitting process involved. The article was talking about how when a transmission line runs for hundreds of miles, it often crosses a combination of state lines, federal and state lands, local jurisdiction, tribal lands, private land. And like all of this requires different regulations and different approval processes. And then a lot of the time they receive opposition from environmentalists, ironically. So getting permits and going through lawsuits can take years. And the article gave the example of there's a $3 billion 700-mile trans-west transmission line, which is intended to connect this large wind farm in Wyoming to consumers in other states. And it took 15 years just to get the approval for construction to begin. And it's estimated that the construction itself is going to take another 5 years, which is fucking ridiculous. And then on top of that, you have to think of all the other components, the need for skilled labor. The article was saying it takes like up to several years to train someone because the work with power lines carrying up to 500,000 volts of electricity is incredibly dangerous and requires skilled workers. There's the ever-present supply issues because all of the copper and iron and other minerals have to be mined and processed. The transformers needed for bulk power delivery on high voltage transmission lines are typically custom built, and the wait time for just one can be up to 2 to 3 years. And then according to Meredith Angwin, she's a chemist and author of this book called Shorting the Grid. She says that like these challenges are likely insurmountable. And she said blackouts are just going to get more common. Electricity rates are going to go up as the cost of all this infrastructure build out gets passed down to consumers. And then she also mentioned that on the environmental side, all these steel towers going up are going to affect wildlife and the natural landscape. And she gave a statement to Just the News, and she said, quote, "It's very close to impossible to run a modern civilization on wind and solar. It's just not going to happen," end quote. So there's that.
Well, yeah, and I feel like the electric bills of, all of the citizens of the country are going to be as much as their mortgage by the time this is all set up.
Yeah. And when you combine that with, what we talked about earlier this week with inflation and how they're talking about how, especially with what is it called? Why am I blanking on the word? Not inflation, interest rates. Yes.
Yeah.
Interest rates going up.
Mhm.
Like that's what were we saying? Like it could take up to 40% of someone's paycheck. So
Yeah.
you want to live in this green world where you're not going to be able to afford to live.
15-minute cities.
15-minute cities, yeah. But on a completely different topic and on what we can hopefully call a positive highlight to end the week, we finally have a House Speaker. And I guess Speaker Pro Tempore McHenry was correct when he predicted we would have someone by the end of the week, because I didn't believe that would happen. And I admit that I was wrong. And I thought our shit show Congress would not be able to get their shit together quickly enough to make that happen. But they did. So, Stephanie, what do we know about Mike Johnson from Louisiana? And doesn't it seem like he was chosen fairly easily?
Yes. And I'm like you. I was like, there's no way that they're going to get a speaker in by the end of the week. I'm glad we have a speaker. But in the beginning, I was super skeptical because this guy went from being nominated to selected in like a day and unanimous consent. And I was like, what's going on here? So I actually found a clip of Matt Gaetz on Steve Bannon's War Room podcast where he explains like how the whole process happened. And you're not going to believe how it all went down. So I'm just going to play it. It's kind of a long clip, but it's very interesting.
Emmer agrees that he's going to have his shot, but that it's going to be quick. So we get that through the gestation system early yesterday. So as Emmer is withdrawing, Mark Molinaro, a moderate New York freshman Republican, stands up at the microphone and says, well, instead of restarting this process and having a candidate forum and sending everybody home for a good cry, let's just take a non-binding poll on where people would be on the person who came in second to Tom Emmer, and that was Mike Johnson. And Elise Stefanik said, well, that's against the rules. The rules don't contemplate it. We can't do that. And brilliantly, Mark Molinaro says, then I move for unanimous consent that the rules be waived and we take a poll on whether or not Mike Johnson could be our speaker nominee. And guess who objects to that unanimous consent request? Kevin McCarthy.
Who was that?
Kevin McCarthy stands up and erupts. It says, I object to doing a roll call on Mike Johnson. And Mike Johnson was exasperated. All the times Johnson had voted for McCarthy, had carried his water, maybe even voted for some bills he didn't like because he was working toward the Republican conference's stated objectives under McCarthy. And here was the thing. It showed everyone that it was actually McCarthy who was working to knife Scalise. It was actually McCarthy who was working to knife Jim Jordan. It was McCarthy working to knife everyone. And he hadn't yet figured out a way to knife Mike Johnson. And so he was worried that there was going to be this great unifying moment, and he scuttled the unifying moment. So because of McCarthy's objection, we had to have this 3-hour delay. And, candidates announce again, have another forum. And guess what happens during that delay, Steve? Patrick McHenry runs to the House floor, opens it up out of recess, and then adjourns till noon today. Now, why did he do that? Because they were setting up a play to block Mike Johnson with write-in votes in the intra-conference process for Kevin McCarthy. They were promising people hearings on their favorite legislation, passage of bills. I heard people promised, maybe you'll get a chairmanship. And the play was for McCarthy to return as speaker, and then Jim Jordan to be the deputy speaker in some sort of like Dwight Schrute assistant to the regional manager posture. And that would have been debasing to Jordan, someone I like a great deal, and it would have been empowering to McCarthy. So Garrett Graves and all these people are working to try to effectuate this return of McCarthy. And they're telling us they're going to be 100 votes for McCarthy on the write-in. You know how many there were? 33 on the first write-in. So they flame out terribly. Mike Johnson's gaining momentum. Ultimately, McCarthy gets 43 to vote for him on a secret ballot, but Mike Johnson gets a majority. And then he says, you know what I want? I want a roll call vote. so that those 43 would have to announce themselves as being for a candidate who wasn't even running instead of a unifying force like Mike Johnson. And when we called for the roll call, do you know how many people voted for Kevin McCarthy? 0. He went from zero. So he went from promising 100 votes to delivering 43 to 0 willing to vote for him. And everyone in the room knew at that moment that I wasn't the force for chaos. I wasn't causing disunity. That for the last 3 weeks, the reason the House of Representatives has been paralyzed is because for his own selfish gain, Kevin McCarthy was sabotaging the candidacy of anyone else because he was plotting a return. And
Wow.
Hmm.
So basically, even though Kevin McCarthy said he wasn't running, he absolutely was in secret, making all these side deals with people to vote for him. He was a little weasel trying to sabotage this whole thing the entire time. And I am so glad he got called out on it. And his friends like Scalise could see that he completely stabbed them in the back. And thankfully, the drama is over. And what I saw in the announcement room was a room full of Republicans that were smiling, they were unified, they were like praying together, and they just seemed ready to get to work and be done with all of this. So Emmer gave a speech where he said that from the outside, it probably looked like complete chaos and confusion with no end in sight. But from his perspective, it was one of the greatest experiences in recent history of the Republic. He said that throughout history, speakers' races were done behind closed doors with political promises and tyrannical threats for those who didn't fall in line, similar to what McCarthy got caught doing. But that this race under a Republican majority was open, honest, and transparent. He said, I feel like we can read between the lines here that Kevin McCarthy, like, I think it's completely out in the open now to all of his little buddies that he is completely part of the deep state. And that may have gone unchecked for decades, but I think that this was the first step in stopping it and like calling it out and just showing it for not only the House to see, but for the entire public to see. And like, that's really what politics is all about, like debating and fighting for the will of the people, not the will of career politicians. And once again, Matt Gaetz, like, holy shit, this guy was right the whole time. And he has taken big risk after big risk. And again, like, this could have been a complete disaster, but I think it worked out for the best. And like I said, I was skeptical of Johnson because I don't know much about him. He has that look of like a typical politician, but I guess he's a constitutional attorney. And I watched his speech. And if you guys have a chance, it's only like 15 minutes. I would watch it. I actually got like a really good feeling from it. He immediately showed support for Israel and also made a pledge that they would help support Israel. He addressed the border and the fentanyl crisis. And then he went into how the cost of living in America is just not sustainable. He said prices have gone up 17% in the last 2 years, and interest rates are the highest that they've been in 3 decades. And so he was focused on how they need to bring relief to the American people by reining in federal spending. And of course, these are all topics that we've covered heavily. So I was just glad to hear him like address them very clearly and definitively. He talked about the 7 core principles of our nation since its founding, which are individual freedom, limited government, the rule of law, peace through strength, fiscal responsibility, free markets, and human dignity. And he ended with making it known that this speaker's office will be decentralizing power. He wants his office to be known for accountability, trust, and transparency. And I have to say that, I didn't know what to think of him in the beginning, but he is so well spoken and so good at building rapport. And he just has that like charismatic personality where he's just a likable guy that by the end of his speech, even the Democrats who refused to stand up or clap during the whole entire speech, even they were standing and clapping for him by the end of it. And it just left me feeling so good and so hopeful. Way better than McCarthy, like no doubt. And while I was disappointed that Jim Jordan didn't get it, I am really happy with this end result. And I just have a gut feeling that like this guy is going to be a game changer for the Republican Party and just for the House as a whole.
I hope you're right, because that's definitely what's needed. And like Republicans need to unite the way Democrats do. And now I have to go watch this speech because I have not seen it. And I want to see what you see, because I still think it's a little odd the way everything happened. But sounds like it's a really good thing. So I'm going to go watch that speech.
Yeah, I would love to get your feedback on it just to see. But you know me, like I always trust that feeling, that gut feeling, intuition. And I just feel like no one saw this coming and it's going to be for the good. So yeah, watch it. Let me know. Everyone listening, go watch it. Let us know. And yeah, thanks for listening. And